Tucked away in the vast and rugged expanse of Colorado lies Buffalo Ranch, a secluded 15,000-acre property home to incredibly bizarre reports over the years. Its general location is not publicly known as the owners value their privacy. Recently, I covered Clearview Ranch, a place on the outskirts of a small town north of Colorado Springs, which became the epicenter of a series of strange incidents. Like Clearview, Buffalo Ranch has its own share of unusual and unsettling occurrences. The owners of the ranch employed Jeff Sailors as the foreman, and he was responsible for tending the ranch over a 9-year period. Jeff would later go on to state that his tenure was far from ordinary. During his time at the ranch, he reported witnessing events that challenged his sanity, and from his perspective seemed to defy logic and his understanding of the world. These events and reports didn't start with Jeff himself though, and to his knowledge had been going on for at least 3 years before his arrival. The owners of the ranch, alongside neighbouring ranches, had reported seeing unusual lights about the place, loud sounds that seemed to emanate from nowhere among many of the oddities. While we do not know the specific year, Jeff arrived at Buffalo Ranch in the dead of winter and the land was blanketed with layers of snow. He'd made an effort to get to know some of the locals, and during this time he'd heard some strange rumours about the place. Livestock going missing, or their carcasses being found under unusual circumstances, among other strange things. Jeff didn't really know how to take that at the time, and mostly just dismissed it as idle gossip, thinking that it was something of a natural exaggeration of life in such a remote place. The first oddity that Jeff experienced, he didn't initially connect it to the strange happening on the property until much later. Jeff had travelled all the way from Montana, and he'd brought pretty much everything that he'd collected over the years. He unloaded his trailer into the back of the ranch shop, and just figured that he'd deal with it at some point in the future. Months went by, and he spent most of his time caring for the massive buffalo head present, alongside the other animals. He also needed to take the time to repair the fencing along the boundaries, which took him a lot longer than he thought it would. Afterwards, he finally found the time to sift through and organise his things in the ranch shop, but he realised that some of his items were missing. Jeff had a pair of mountain goat horns that were very sentimental to him, and they just weren't among his things. He was also down an expensive camera that he'd had for years. At the time, he had some ranch hands helping out, though while it wasn't made totally clear, they were not permanent employees, but rather were either temporary employees to help Jeff get started, or they were there learning how to tend a ranch. Either way, Jeff thought that one of them had stolen from him, though he didn't accuse them of it. Months after just accepting the loss, he planned to spend some time with his girlfriend, whose real name wasn't given, so we'll refer to her as Amy. They had planned to travel to and stay in a town about 70 miles away from the ranch, which I believe was roughly halfway between their two residences. Jeff liked to have his 44 single action in his truck, but had forgotten it back at the ranch. He'd been dancing with Amy, and when the night came to an end, not having access to it bugged him so much that he decided to travel the 70 miles all the way back to get it. He arrived back at the ranch and stepped into the kitchen where he knew he'd left it. On the table, there it was, but right next to it was the camera and the goat horns. Jeff said that he didn't even know what to think about this. He didn't know if he was being pranked or if one of the ranch hands had felt bad about taking it and returned it. If they did feel bad about taking it, he wasn't sure why they wouldn't have placed it somewhere more discreetly, where whoever had done this would have had some plausible deniability. Nobody ever owned up to taking them, and Jeff, aside from the owners, was the only person with keys. He said that he didn't find any signs of forced entry or anything like that. He explained that it felt violating in some sense, because he knew someone must have been right there in his home, but he just didn't know who it was, or how. As spring came around though in March, Jeff would have his first taste of the weirdness that was to come. Amy had come to stay at the ranch for a while, so they could spend some time together. On one of the days that she was there, they'd spent it riding horses, and Jeff essentially gave her a tour of the property. They went to bed that night, and the weather had essentially been clear throughout the entire time. Sometime after midnight, this tranquility was shattered. Without warning, a massive windstorm struck the ranch house out of nowhere. Jeff reported that the force of the wind was like nothing he'd ever experienced. The walls groaned under the pressure, heavy framed artwork crashed to the floor, and a set of moose antlers securely nailed to a log wall was ripped off with an incredibly loud crack. The windows were rattling and the walls were vibrating, and Jeff described the howling wind as deafening. Jeff said that it was like every wall in the house felt like it was under attack, and he thought it was a tornado. He and Amy rushed out of the bed and took cover in the closet for shelter. The property didn't have a basement, and he felt as though that was their only immediate option. Jeff said, "That wind was so ferocious, I didn't think we'd make it." The storm only lasted for a few minutes, but for Jeff and Amy it felt a lot longer. The sound reached an unbearable level, and then suddenly it just stopped. Jeff described that it didn't wind down, it literally just came to an abrupt stop. He then described that the silence was almost more unsettling than the storm itself in a way, because it just stopped, like flipping a switch. With their hearts still ready to be out their chests, they got out the closet, still shook, and walked slowly to the stairs, trying to navigate around shards of glass and everything else that now littered the floor. Jeff went down to the kitchen window and was expecting to see just absolute destruction everywhere. He thought he was going outside to see fallen trees and just all of his repair work undone. Instead, he observed that everything was fine. The night was still, the air was perfectly calm, and there was no damage to anything. He said, "I went out there in the morning after that windstorm, and it looked like nobody had set foot in that yard for 50 years. I walked over to the first auto gate, and I could see my girlfriend's tyre tracks coming in from the night before, and right at that auto gate, beyond it towards the house, they disappeared. The wind had scoured everything. I circled the house, and in a 300 to 400 foot perimeter, all the way around the house, it was just blown clean, like nobody had ever been there." Or in other words, the vicious storm that Jeff and Amy had reported emanated from within the perimeter of the house and didn't reach beyond it. Neither of them really understood what had happened and tried to brush the incident off as just being victim to a very rare and unlucky weather event. Wrong place, wrong time, he thought. However, according to Jeff, this wasn't the only strange thing of this nature to occur to the house. For context, the homestead was isolated and sat close to the very centre of the 15,000 acre open land, and the neighbours were well out of earshot of the property. Jeff described that on most nights, the stillness was so profound that sound could carry for miles. Now, weirdly, on one occasion not long after the storm, Jeff said that he awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of rock music playing. He said that it came out of nowhere, and it was like Jim Morrison or Led Zeppelin was right outside the house. According to Jeff, the music was so loud that it seemed as though a full-blown rock concert was taking place right outside on the ranch, causing the entire homestead to vibrate. Jeff raced out of bed, again with his heart ready to beat out of his chest. He was panicked and in full alert mode. He got himself armed and took a flashlight and ran down the stairs. He thought someone was pranking him or something like that, but as he got outside and lit the place up with light, there was just nobody there. He then rushed to his truck and circled the property, and while he was doing this, the music abruptly stopped. Specifically, he said that it didn't fade, it just ended. There was nothing to find, no other vehicles, no other people that he could see, and no source of the music. As he parked back up next to the property, he started to question his sanity. Then he thought back to the storm and started to think, or realise I suppose, that it wasn't the first time he'd experienced something out of the ordinary on the property. And he also reasoned that it wasn't only himself that had experienced this, since Amy was right there too the first time. Jeff didn't sleep much that night after that. He laid in bed with a sense of bewilderment and unease, as if he just didn't quite feel safe. He reasoned that the house was about 1.5 miles away from the country road, and again, smack dab in the middle of the land. He knew that the music had to have come from somewhere, but there was no evidence to suggest that someone had come through the 3 locked gates that separate the ranch house from the outside world. He also didn't understand how it was so loud and thought that this wasn't just a speaker placed outside the homestead, and would have required some serious setup to manage to shake the house. Another incident of this type occurred again not too long after this. Similarly, in the middle of the night, in total darkness, he was jolted awake, not by the sound of music, but this time it was bird calls. In Jeff's testimony, this wasn't just a few chirps. These were what he thought were loud bird calls, coming from every direction and filling the air with an overwhelming cacophony, like they were in the same room as him and also right outside the window. Jeff had been a bird watcher for most of his life, starting at around 12 years old, and used to work with a licensed bander in Montana. He described that he'd handled hundreds of birds, eagles, owls, hawks, osprey, among others. But something was amiss here. He said that he recognised some of the calls, but others he didn't think were local to the region. He said that he was hearing tropical birds and didn't recognise a lot of them. He followed his usual routine. He got up and went outside and got in his truck to light up the place. This time though, he did not go back to bed, instead determined to understand what the source of the noise was. Soon after driving around, the sounds just stopped abruptly again. He said that he spent the rest of the night and almost the entire day inspecting every inch of the property, looking for some kind of sound system. He found nothing. That night, he went back outside and was hanging around the gates. He'd already inspected them and found no evidence of a break-in, or intruders tampering with them. There were no vehicle tracks aside from his truck and his dirt bike that he kept on site. He'd been out on the property until the early hours, essentially wasting the whole day. The next morning, Jeff was groggy, tired and frustrated, as he was now behind on the things that he needed to get done around the ranch. He was also about to be confused. He stumbled out of bed, down the stairs, and made his way through the living room towards the kitchen to make his morning coffee. He stopped in the doorway and stared down at the kitchen floor. Next to the fridge, everything from inside it, the eggs, condiments, and everything else had been removed and placed into a 6-foot triangle on the floor. He said that he just froze. He didn't know what to do, he didn't know what to think, he was just stood in the doorway looking down at this. When he was later talking about this, he described that the items weren't just placed at random, rather it was precise and deliberate. Jeff's dog and the puppy he was looking after gave no warning of an intruder during the night. His Australian shepherd, Muna, was described as an exceptional watchdog, and he said that Muna could detect the faintest sound of a vehicle approaching down the country road over a mile away, which would make him bark every time. The second dog was a young blue heeler and had not barked or made a fuss during the night. Jeff must have been questioning if he'd become sleep deprived or what, but he also began to wonder if he was being targeted somehow by someone, but he just didn't know how it was happening. The time frame isn't clear, but things were quiet for a while after this, but then something else happened, something a bit more ominous. As said, this was a fairly large ranch, and it was the kind of size that needed a team of people to manage it, but it was only Jeff on site, and this made ensuring the herd remained healthy and accounted for was quite time consuming. He would joke and say that he was the foreman of a one-man crew. One morning, he rode out to check on the buffalo, and he came across a sight that froze him in his tracks. A large bull was lying in the open pasture with its massive frame just completely still. At first, Jeff thought that he'd been the victim of animal predation or natural causes, but as he approached, he said that he realised he was seeing something completely different. Jeff described that various parts of the carcass had been removed, seemingly intentionally, including the reproductive organs. He said that there were no fluids on the ground and no tracks to indicate what might have done it. He towered over it, trying to rationalise what he was seeing. While inspecting it, he knew animal predation was out the window, but started to think that there must have been a trespasser on the ranch, though he didn't understand how this kind of operation was even possible, especially without leaving any evidence behind, such as tyre tracks. This reminds me of reports coming from all over the US in the 50s and beyond, with investigative bodies at one point believing this exact kind of scenario was the work of cults. It's bizarre stuff, and the articles from back then are a very weird read. Most of the articles follow a similar theme. Some kind of rancher finds a scene like this, local law enforcement are baffled, and then federal law enforcement blames it on highly organised cults. To my knowledge, despite all of the reports over the years, nobody has ever been caught doing this or arrested for it, which is interesting in and of itself. Anyway, for Jeff, it didn't stop there, and over the months that followed, he said that he came across other buffalo carcasses that had been scattered over the land. He began to take notes of what he was seeing, and pretty much all of them resembled the first one he described, but some of them had an elliptical incision on the abdomen, which had crusted, and Jeff speculated that it seemed as though they had been introduced to a lot of heat or something like that. Jeff said that the most stark detail that he'd noticed was that on some of the buffalo carcasses there would be a very faint orangey red triangle mark on the forehead. On cows, he said, some of them had this same shape but on their rib cage. Each time he came across one of these scenes, he would inform local law enforcement, and he ended up getting to know the sheriff, who he dubbed Wally, fairly well. Jeff described him as a man of great courage and was, quote, as good a lawman as I've ever seen. Wally didn't really know what to make of what he was seeing, and similar to Jeff at the start, wondered if criminal activity was taking place in the area. Jeff, I believe, at this time started to think there was just something completely out of the ordinary going on. Wally essentially told Jeff that they were going to investigate and set up a patrol route so that whoever was doing this might be dissuaded if they caught a glimpse of law enforcement. And also that Jeff was free to call him if he was ever spooked or if he needed help or to report anything. The actual owners of the ranch took this seriously and said that their financial losses were becoming untenable, as they'd lost around 30 from the herd. In response, the owner invested in security, giving Jeff access to night vision goggles along with arming him with some serious equipment. Jeff's friendly relations with the sheriff's office would set off this next incident. One night, through his bedroom window, he could see lights in the field, he said. They looked like old Jeep headlights moving low to the ground, glowing that lime green colour you see through night vision goggles, that kind of luminescent stuff. Jeff had reported the lights on 27 separate occasions, but was never able to get a good glimpse of what they were, as they would just disappear if you got too close to them. One such night would be different. Wally had called Jeff to let him know that he'd be driving through the ranch again, and I believe wanted Jeff to leave the gates unlocked for him. Wally had a ride along with him, though the deputy's name wasn't mentioned. Jeff was fine with it and joked that Wally had pretty much become a regular visitor of the ranch. Wally had issued Jeff a radio so that the two of them could communicate and organise these visits. Wally told him that he was going to drive out to the farm grounds on the north end of the property, which was approximately 4 miles away from the house that Jeff was staying in. Jeff watched as Wally's truck passed through the yard and then settled down for the night with a book. About an hour had passed when Jeff said that his radio started going crazy with static and yelling. He said that he could hear Wally and that he sounded panicked and disjointed. The deputy was also shouting. Jeff grabbed the radio and called out to them, but there was just silence and the static had gone. Jeff said that he froze and didn't know what to do. He didn't know if they'd gotten into an accident or if it was something more serious or what. Jeff got himself armed and equipped and went out to his truck by the gate outside. Through the radio, Jeff asked what was happening and Wally replied, "I'm surrounded, we need to leave." Jeff could now see Wally's headlights in the distance, heading back towards him, and he immediately felt sick to his stomach. Behind Wally's car, he described being able to see 6 glowing lights right behind Wally on the ground, formed into a semicircle around the truck and following it. The gate was wide open, and Wally just bolted straight through it, not stopping. Jeff said that as Wally's truck passed through the gate, the lights remained on the other side, not pursuing the truck beyond the home. Jeff then described that 2 of the lights blinked out as though someone had just flicked a light switch, and the others faded out more gradually. Jeff said that Wally was just long gone and didn't make contact with him again that night. He described feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, and it took a while before his adrenaline came down, but once it did, he began to think. He now believed that whatever these lights were, that they were responsible for all of the weirdness going on at the ranch, such as taking the buffalo, causing the storm and the sounds at night, and just generally messing with him, which he didn't understand. He later said that standing alone that night in the vast darkness of the ranch, not knowing if those lights were just going to reappear, is something that affected him quite badly and always stuck with him. While they didn't do anything, he said that he just seemed to feel that they were dangerous and didn't have good intentions. He said, "I was more than freaked out. I mean to tell you, standing out there all by myself in the middle of that ranch after what I'd seen, it was something else." The day afterwards, Jeff tried to contact the sheriff's office to speak to Wally, and he was told that Wally was off sick and would probably be back the following week. 6 days after going off sick, Wally apparently returned to the sheriff's office and resigned. According to Jeff, Wally didn't want to speak about what had happened that night, though he did run into him on numerous occasions in the town. Jeff said that both Wally and his wife were cordial, but Wally just wasn't interested in speaking with him. That was the case for a number of years before Jeff finally got him to sit down with him. Jeff had left the ranch at this point, and the whole conversation wasn't shared, but it did move towards the question of whether what had happened that night was the work of a non-human intelligence. Wally just said that he believed in what he saw, and while Jeff didn't make it totally clear, I'm assuming that's the direction he was leaning. Jeff was posed the same question, and he said that he didn't know. He pretty much just relayed that outside of seeing those lights and experiencing the weirdness, he'd never seen anything that he could concretely say was something from somewhere else, like a vehicle, or a person, or entity, I suppose. He did say though that something weird was happening out there for the 9 years that he stayed there. Jeff later relayed that on one occasion he was driving to a nearby town to do some grocery shopping, and as he was driving alongside the fences, he could see glowing lights of all different colours on the hilltops. He said that he couldn't see the source of the lights, but that they were flashing slowly and were incredibly bright. Jeff continued down towards the highway where there was a road crew, and he asked them what they were. One member of the crew said that there were more flashing lights over in the basin, and said that they might be emergency lights or something. Jim had seen these kind of lights before on the ranch, but didn't mention that to them, instead turning the truck around and just driving back towards the ranch. What he didn't want to happen was to go to the grocery store, then for things to get dark and have to drive back past the lights that he felt might represent a threat, so he just thought that he'd do the shopping another time. Instead, he headed to a hill near the ranch to get a vantage point, hoping to observe whatever this was from a safe distance. From his location, he watched as the lights moved erratically across the sky. As he sat there, scanning the horizon and contemplating what to make of the bizarre display, a new light caught his attention. To the south, a faint amber glow emerged, distinct from the other lights. At first, it appeared stationary, but as he watched, he realised it was slowly moving towards where he sat. It was unlike any of the lights Jeff and others had seen over the years at the ranch, as it was larger. Then, without warning, two smaller lights appeared on either side of the main one. They were the same amber hue, but only half the size, creating a triangular shape. This was something that Jeff had never seen before. As he watched, the lights slowly drew closer, and after around 15 minutes, Jeff could see they were clearly moving in his direction. Two more tiny lights appeared at the edges of the formation. The amber glow was dominating his view, and they were closing the distance between themselves and his position atop the hill. Sitting alone at the top, surrounded by vast fields, Jeff said that he again felt an overwhelming sense of dread, and that he was scared of these things for some reason. As the lights came closer, he described having a bit of decision paralysis. He couldn't decide whether he should have gotten in the truck and drove away, or whether he should have stayed put and see what happened. Before he could decide, the lights started flickering. Jeff said that at first, the two smaller lights on the outer edges blinked out. Then, the two on the inside followed suit, leaving only the large central glow. At first, everything seemed normal, but then Jeff realised that most of the stars directly overhead were gone. He described that there was a straight line in the sky. To the left of this line, he could see the stars. To the right of it, it was just a void and total blackness. It dawned on him slowly, the enormity of what he was seeing. The void, as he would later call it, wasn't still and was moving silently across the sky, blotting out the stars as it passed beneath them. Whatever it was, it went directly over his truck. And though he thought that there was something absolutely enormous in the sky above him, he wasn't quite sure. He said that it was so big he couldn't tell its shape or whatever it was. As this void moved towards the north, Jeff noticed a series of lights flickering into view along its edge. Then, he said, it disappeared and the stars filled the sky again. Jeff's adrenaline had been pumping this entire time, and he still felt absolutely terrified. He got in his truck, and instead of heading back to the ranch house, he put his foot to the floor and drove towards the town he initially planned on going to. Then, he experienced the very thing that Wally had. There was an intense white light in the sky, and he believed it had started to pursue him. For whatever reason, he just felt that it meant to harm him. Jeff was driving at close to 100 miles per hour at one point, and this light was right behind, matching his speed the entire way before it just vanished. By the time he reached the town, his hands were trembling and he sat in a diner, looking white as a sheet. He stayed in there for a number of hours, just replaying all the events of the night back in his mind. Jeff recalled that at around the 5-year mark of his tenure on site, which was way before Wally had resigned, he found himself at wit's end. The ongoing strangeness had taken its toll on him mentally. The lights, the animal carcasses that he was finding, and just having a general sense that there was something present with him that he couldn't see. As a seasoned hunter and outdoorsman, he decided that he wanted to take some action. From his perspective, whatever was hiding in the prairie, he wanted to know what it was. According to Jeff, the week leading up to his decision had been particularly trying. He said that he'd found another buffalo in a similar state to the others, and the sheriff's department had been out on the ranch and they'd seen the green lights just hanging around in the fields. He said that Wally, before the incident that made him resign, was just never able to get close to them. Witnesses, which also included Wally, reported that the lights were capable of very high speeds. With the ranch owner's blessing and financial backing, he set out one night, armed, and with surveillance equipment, such as the night vision goggles that had been given to him. He drove along the perimeter until spotting what appeared to be one of these elusive lights near a hilltop, approximately 5 miles away from the ranch house. Jeff left the vehicle and wanted to approach it on foot, as he didn't want to make any noise. Upon reaching the ridge line, he dropped to his belly and crawled through the grass towards the light, which he thought had dropped into the basin on the other side. At approximately 3/4 of a mile away, using night vision, he thought he was seeing someone that was very tall, standing in the basin, motionless. He said that he began crawling closer to it and closed the distance slowly over the next 2 hours. Once he was around 100 yards away, he set up a tripod and kept the stationary figure in its sights. Jeff stayed in position for an hour, and it still had not moved. He got up to his feet and advanced slowly to within 20 yards of it. At this point, he lowered his equipment as the realization dawned on him. For the past however many hours, he'd been hunting a pine tree stump. While standing there, feeling a bit silly and bemused by the whole situation, he questioned whether the light he'd seen had anything to do with anything on the ranch. As Jeff's relationship with Amy became more serious, she and her 2 girls, aged 4 and 9, began to stay over at the ranch every weekend. They typically spent their time riding horses and teaching the girls how to do it. He was also teaching them about ranch work and how to care for the animals. On this particular weekend, something unsettling happened. The 9-year-old had been playing out of sight behind the horse barn, while Amy and Jeff were sat on the porch with a hot drink. Suddenly, they heard hysterical screams coming from the direction of the barn. They both ran to her, and while crying, she just pointed towards the barn. Jeff went in there and quickly noticed what had spooked her so badly. Inside the barn, according to Jeff, there were 3 carcasses stacked on top of one another. At the bottom was a buffalo, in the middle was a cow, and on top, he said, there was a calf. He went on and stated that he didn't know how they'd gotten in there in the first place, as it was fairly cramped and usually they would avoid such spaces. He then asked Amy and the girls to go inside the ranch house while he investigated what had happened. He opened the doors wide open to allow light into the space, and he quickly realised that there was nothing normal about this. Like the others he'd found over the years, he said that there were no fluids on the ground and there was nothing to indicate how they got to their position. He wondered at first if they might have been dragged into position, but the ground just didn't indicate that. He then realised that the faint orange-red triangle was present on the calf. No matter how many times this happened, he said that it never got easier to deal with or understand. Jeff didn't say what the outcome of this event was, but I assume like the others, he told Wally about it. During the summer, Jeff was once again fencing, and as it started to get darker, he watched as a truck pulled into his yard. Jeff got in his truck and drove back to the house where he could see a man that he didn't recognise loitering around his vehicles. The man was knelt beside one of Jeff's trucks as he pulled up, and he challenged him about it, asking him what he was doing. The man got up and, according to Jeff, pulled out his FBI badge and identified himself as a federal agent. Jeff asked him what he wanted and why he was there. This agent apparently told him that he was putting trackers on his vehicles to differentiate friendlies from potential intruders, though he did not specifically elaborate on what he meant by that. He told Jeff that they'd taken an interest in the police reports that had been filed, and he seemed to have a particular interest in the buffalo carcasses. He explained that Jeff wasn't in trouble, they didn't suspect him of any wrongdoing, and the trackers were so that they could monitor the comings and goings around the property. Jeff was questioned by the man, and he explained what had been happening on the ranch. He shared the stories surrounding the buffalo, the lights that seemed to chase people, and the other weirdness that had transpired. The agent made a remark that stuck in Jeff's mind. He said, "If you catch one of these sons of we'll have them in jail by dark," to which Jeff replied, you know what's happening out here, don't you? The agent didn't give him any more information and then left soon after. Jeff then called Wally, and he said that Wally was just as surprised as he was at this unannounced visit. He said that his office had not been notified that they would be operating in their jurisdiction. A week after this visit, there was another by two men this time. They identified themselves as faculty members from a university in Michigan that had been flown out by an unnamed federal agency to collect samples from the buffalo carcasses. Jeff led them to one that was fairly recent, and apparently, according to Jeff, they gathered tissue samples from various parts of it. These men then stated that it was odd that there was no evidence that the carcass had been tampered with by scavengers, and alluded to the idea that it appeared as though it had been purposefully avoided by them. Apparently, they told Jeff that they would phone him to share the results, and they kept their word. They told him that the carcass was effectively toxic, and it's likely that the toxicity had caused heart failure, though they weren't sure why their internal systems were as toxic as they were. Secondly, Jeff said that they'd found crystalline structures in the tissue that were unfamiliar to them. And finally, as Jeff had suspected from the get-go, they also had said that it looked as though the elliptical shapes on the abdomen had been produced with a lot of heat. That was pretty much all they told him. Jeff also pointed out that when he eventually left the ranch, he would open up to other ranchers, and some of them had their own stories to share about such things. This made Jeff think that whatever was happening might be something that's widespread, which is an interesting thought given the other ranches I've covered here on the channel. I'll leave a link to the playlist in the description below where you can hear about similar reported situations to this. Now, obviously, with these kind of stories, there is always a lot to be skeptical about, and it's probably best to take some things with a grain of salt. In all fairness, it certainly does appear as though Jeff was sharing his story sincerely, which you can actually watch for yourself on YouTube, so I'll also leave a link to his channel in the description below. In regards to these stories, one question that I always have is, where are the pictures? These things were supposedly going on for so long that surely you'd think there might be a good body of photographic evidence to support everything outside of just witness testimony. Although, I suppose the events could have happened before everyone had a phone in their pocket. You'd also think that if these lights, whatever they were inciting someone to feel fear and dread as described, and made you feel as though you were in harm's way and in danger, you'd think that you wouldn't just stick around for years and years. I suppose people react differently and have their own tolerances. I would point out that the moment I saw them, followed by finding a carcass that had bits missing weirdly, with a triangle on its head, there would be a me-shaped hole through the ranch gate. It's certainly an interesting story, and I'd like to hear what your take is. Not just this one, but the weird ranch reports in general. What do you think? I'm just not sure why an advanced people would come here from somewhere else just to troll us and rearrange the contents of the fridge onto the floor. Maybe they just like pranks and have a sense of humour, who knows. Anyway, that about brings us to the end of this, so please do leave your comments down below. I'd also just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. If you enjoyed this video, please do remember to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, it helps me a lot. If you didn't like it, then feel free to give me a thumbs down, I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day, or evening, depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys, peace.